Dick Bove, bank analyst with Rafferty Capital Markets. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You have a book out about why we need big banks. Big banks are under threat. Banks like JPMorgan, Bank of America, Citigroup. Why do you think they're under threat?
Well, first off, why we need them is because we're in a huge global financial system. The convertible currency in the world is 56 trillion, and I think by the year 2050 it'll be 81 trillion. And the Canadian banks are growing rapidly. In fact, of the 9 biggest banks in North America, 5 are Canadian, 4 are American. The Chinese banks are growing rapidly, and we're trying to shrink our banks, which means we're going to shrink our way out of the system.
And what are the consequences of that? Who cares if the United States has smaller banks than Canada or China?
Well, the large multinational corporations in this country would have to seek their funding overseas because there's a, if you will, limit, a legal limit on how much a bank can lend relative to its size. The United States government, right now, of the 21 primary dealers that the U.S. government uses to raise funds, 14 are foreign banks, 7 are American banks, which is an indication of a need for big banks. And we would lose the reserve currency. If we lose the reserve currency, we have to pay back our debt, which would create all sorts of havoc in this country.
But how serious is the threat? I mean, you recommend these banks actually to investors right now. You recommend they buy their stock. Mm-hmm. So if you believe the banks are under threat, why buy the stock?
Well, I believe the U.S. financial system is under threat. American banks are making huge amounts of money. In other words, all of the negative things that supposedly developed from all of this regulation hit the American public, hit corporations, hit the United States government, did not hit the banks. Banks in 2013 will make more money than they've ever made in their history, and in 2014 they're going to beat that record.
So are you saying that the banks, you think the banks will continue to be large but perhaps be located and be doing all of their business outside the U.S.?
Well, the American banks are not going to grow if we continue to do what we're doing, because what the government keeps doing, or the regulators keep doing, is they keep changing the rules of the game to prevent growth in the American banks. So the American banks, the biggest banks in the United States, in fact, are not growing. They since 2010, when Dodd-Frank was passed, they have not increased their share of the American financial system.
Well, how could they? I mean, aren't they about as big as they can get? I mean, they grew dramatically after the crisis because they bought up the banks that failed. How much bigger could they get?
Well, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, which is the biggest bank in the world, will make about $45 billion in 2013. That's more than Wells Fargo and JPMorgan put together, and those are the 2 banks that make the most money in the United States. So they could get considerably bigger.
All right, Dick Bove, thank you very much.